Hello and welcome again to the Land and Climate podcast. My name is Alasdair, and in this episode I spoke to Thea Riofrancos on her new book, Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. Thea is Associate Professor of Political Science at Providence College and also is a strategic co-director of the think tank, the Climate and Community Institute. She's also a long-time expert researcher and commentator on mineral mining and mineral extraction. Extraction, the book, centres on the sourcing of lithium for the growing needs of the renewable energy transition.
Overall, we have increasing growth in the fossil fuel industry, record profit years recently, and the growth of renewables deployment. The main issue with the energy transition is that it's that we have not figured out a politically successful or palatable way to really keep fossil fuels in the ground. We have figured out ways to incentivize renewable energy, but in a growing energy system, especially with the data center thing, we can have more of everything and we then have more emissions, and we're not really actually doing mitigation, we're just doing addition.
I began by asking her to explain the main themes of her book and how she came to write it.
On one hand, I'm very aware of the harms of mining and of the frontline movements that are working to oppose specific mines or an extractive mode of development writ large. On the other hand, I'm aware that the material and physical build out of an energy transition anywhere, including the US, will involve mining, and mining that can be quite harmful in order to provide inputs for so-called green technologies. The origin of this book is me grappling with the research I'd done as a scholar, the advocacy I was doing with an activist, and where there was a kind of interface and point of tension between those two. And it sent me on a journey that began in Chile, where a lot of the world's lithium comes from. It's the number 2 global producer after Australia. Going to the Atacama Desert was just really eye-opening in terms of the uniqueness of that extractive frontier and what it tells us about the history and future of energy systems. But then the journey kept going in ways that were honestly serendipitous, but that took me to the EU, to Brussels, to Portugal, to Nevada in the US Southwest, looking at themes in addition to those of the tension between local environmental protection and indigenous rights on the one hand, and climate action and green technology supply chains on the other. That also brought me to themes of geopolitics, like why are Europe and the US trying to onshore these supply chains, including their mining nodes? It took me to looking at corporate strategy, both on the kind of investment front, but also in terms of how corporations manage and deal with the growing discontent around mining. And it ultimately landed me into thinking from a policy, but also kind of political organizing perspective about how supply chains could be organized differently. And that probably brought me to some of the edges of my own expertise and doing collaborative work with other experts around how to really rethink these supply chains from the ground up and what that could offer to climate politics and climate strategy.
A lot of your book is about Chile. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the history of extraction in Chile, even prior to lithium extraction.
Chile has a long history dating to the emergence of the Chilean state as a formal independent state once they won independence from Spain. We could even go further back into how Spanish colonialism shaped all of this, but I'll bring us at least into the 19th century to start with, which is that the Chilean state in its very early days, bureaucrats and officials really hit on mining as like the sector that was going to provide the fiscal basis of the state itself, right? So we can see that in a way, the origins of the state and the origins of mining are intertwined with one another, right? And there were a variety of sectors that were contemplated and that were explored and extracted over decades and centuries, whether it's saltpeter or copper, and then later on lithium. And these sectors are all in the same northern region of Chile. And so we have these also cumulative effects on the landscape, on indigenous communities, on ecosystems. But alongside that broad sweeping history, we can get a little bit more specific into the way that Chile really visibilizes dramatically different approaches to governing extractive sectors and to the way that political conflict around them is also organized and structured. So as some listeners may be familiar, Chile had a democratic socialist government under Salvador Allende in the early 1970s that itself was preceded what we might call like progressive nationalist kind of government. So he was actually himself building on a pre-established legacy in which the Chilean state for the first time was really asserting itself and taking forms of ownership control of the very sectors that were the lifeblood of its economy, but had been owned by, at that moment, American multinationals owned the majority of the copper sector. And so Allende, building on some prior policy moves, made a bolder move of nationalizing the main copper mines in the country, bringing them under Chilean control. What's quite interesting is also what happened next, and many people will be familiar with the story of the violent coup organized by General Augusto Pinochet that unseated Allende's government and led to 2 decades of a quite brutal and neoliberal dictatorship. But an interesting aspect is, and this departs a little bit from some of our simplistic understandings of neoliberalism as just like unfettered markets and deregulation. I think a better way to think about neoliberalism is shaping the economy to the benefits of capitalism, which sometimes can involve state intervention. So one of the things that Pinochet did early in his time in office is actually establish the state-owned company, which is now a well-known global company, Codelco, that took over the management of these nationalized mines. And he did so because the military at that time and for many decades afterwards depended very much so on copper for its own revenues and ability to purchase military hardware. And so copper was very tied into the military and to forms of kind of nationalism in Chile. But at the same time that Pinochet solidified the national control of some of these copper mines, he also courted new private investment. So you got this interesting dynamic over time where it became a kind of mixed sector that involved state ownership, but also involved a huge amount of multinational investment. And then fast forward to lithium, the lithium sector really developed under Pinochet. And there's just an interesting historical anecdote here, which might resonate a bit in the present, given how lithium is framed as like a strategic or critical mineral. It was in the 1970s too, but for a different reason in Chile. It was because, and there's other examples in other countries as well, where Chile classified lithium as a strategic element because of its role in nuclear weaponry. And Pinochet also asserted, again, with this militaristic, nationalistic paradigm, like the state should have a bit more involvement in the lithium sector because it can be used for nuclear weaponry. This is during the Cold War, of course. And so anyway, you have this mixed private-public, but very much to the benefit of private investors because it involves courting of major lithium companies that set up shop on the Atacama Salt Flat, which is where the lithium is extracted from, to great ecological and water and social detriment, and this state-capital collaboration in a way. And just to round it out to the present, this has led to concerted and ongoing conflicts over lithium, both in terms of lithium's environmental impacts, in terms of the interactions between lithium companies and indigenous communities and their kind of local organizations, as well as with workers and writ large in the country as a whole, just this ongoing contestation over who should own Chile's resource wealth and who should benefit from it. And this is a conflict that reverberates across extractive frontiers and in the global South more generally.
One part of your book talks about what happens in terms of a shift of a lot of the existing lithium mining companies really taking on this energy transition idea in the way that nuclear had been taken on in the 1970s. They're really now going for this idea that there is a kind of race for so-called critical minerals. If you could go into a little bit more depth around that, that'd be really interesting, I think, for our listeners.
Yeah, so I think that it's probably not surprising to your listeners that there is this new gold rush, we could call it, around so-called critical minerals. So what critical minerals are, and that term itself has an origin in military conflict. So military comes up again, as it does a lot in extractive sectors that have these entwinements with violence, with national security politics, with all of these types of things. So critical minerals was first developed as a concept in World War II era in the US. It was then called, I think, strategic materials or strategic minerals, but it became critical later on, which are minerals that were important to the war effort and that needed to be secured. And actually, that was a moment where we almost had a planned economy in the US. So the government took a big role in ensuring that raw materials that were essential to the war mobilization effort were going towards war rather than private consumption or other end uses. And so we see at different moments of geopolitical tension, this concept reemerge, and now it's been really thoroughly embedded in our policy and media discourse. And so what critical minerals now means, it's a little bit broader than just a purely military definition, but it retains that idea, which is they are minerals that are considered essential to either national security and or the functioning of the economy and are vulnerable to some kind of supply disruption. So in the very definition of critical minerals, you have a conflation of national security and the economy as like what's good for one is good for the other, and also a concern about access. Can we being the US, can we access these reliably, or are they prone to supply disruptions? Is all the mining in one country or all the refining in one country such that we're worried about concentration, which is its own kind of vulnerability? We can see immediately how this has gotten more salient in the context of US-China tensions, because for many of these supply streams, whether at the mining node or the refining or processing node, China is quote unquote dominant. These supply chains run through China in a way that they do through no other country. And that has become a source of alarm for American, European, British, et al. Kind of policymakers, right? And so where we are in the present with critical minerals is that over the past few years, policymakers in the places I just named have themselves become less confident about relying on neoliberal globalization or free trade or open markets or whatever that might mean in order to acquire minerals in the quote unquote normal way where we have a global competitive economy. Some countries are mineral producers and those are traded and become imports in places like the US or EU. Instead, what policymakers want to do is securitize these supply chains and also onshore the mining nodes of them so that we would have more mining in the US, in Europe, et cetera, in order to feed into domestic or regional supply chains and therefore be less, quote unquote, reliant on China, but also less reliant maybe on Latin America or Africa or regions that are considered unstable or volatile. We won't get into the fact that American corporations and politics are very related to the so-called volatility of these regions, but hypocrisies abound. But regardless, what that means, though, is a few different things. And this brings us to some of the core themes of the book, which for me as a scholar, as someone that's studied resource extraction in Latin America for a long time now, I've been used to the idea that resources are extracted in the global south and they go to the global north, that we have this whole global economic structure in which the extractive nodes of the economy, which are the most environmentally toxic, they're quite socially contentious, they are linked to these boom and bust cycles, so they're very unreliable economically, that certain countries are like relegated to serve that role. And that remains the case. Like you can look at all manner of empirical data and everything I just said remains true. However, something else also is happening that complexifies that thought a bit, which is that we have powerful global north states that are, for the most part, used to being importers of raw materials that they can acquire cheaply from developing countries. If all of a sudden they are concerned about access to those, they're in this geopolitical conflict with China, and they're like, okay, we got to mine this stuff at home. Then what do we do with our political analysis of the global economy and global justice? There to be more mining in the global north that redistributes environmental harm and doesn't continue this pattern of almost offshoring environmental harm to other places. So I had to really think hard about extractive frontiers in a more planetary sense and the fact that the global north, whether it's the North Sea oil extraction, whether it's the US fracking boom, whether it's mining that's happening now in the US and Europe and Canada, the global north also has these internal frontiers. And lo and behold, they actually can be structured quite similarly in all the negative ways as extractive frontiers in the global south. Maybe the companies are a bit less predatory. Maybe there's a little bit more regulation, depending, not always. Certainly, there's less violence. There's less outright killing of activists, which happens a lot in the global south in mining regions. Yet, the basic fact is marginalized communities, often in rural areas that are subjected to these extractive enterprises that often displace pre-existing livelihoods around agriculture, for example, or might threaten sacred land of indigenous communities in the US and Canada or Sweden or wherever, for example. Those patterns occur at different scales and in different regions in the world economy. So it prompted me to have a more holistic analysis around extraction itself and to understand how these extractive economies can also occur within the global north. They may not be exactly the same, but it's worth attending to, including to have a more robust global analysis of how to reduce the harms of extraction.
From reading your book, there are some very common negative impacts with extraction. And if you could list those, I know you do in your book, but that would be great just for listeners. I think just to get a picture of what those real impacts are now. I know you go into them with lithium, but they go into all kinds of extraction, really.
Yes, and I should have mentioned that lithium is, of course, one of many so-called critical minerals for the energy transition. The list is extremely long and it's only growing. And now it's not just the energy transition, it's AI, it's data centers, it's the rearmament of Europe. And if that occurs, and what that will mean for raw material demand, because militaries are major consumers of raw materials. And there's now quite a number of pressures on a kind of overlapping set of landscapes globally. It's important to understand this narrative shift where what was justified for the energy transition now is justified by AI, but it's really the same set of dynamics in terms of the raw material provision. What's so bad about extraction? First and foremost, the ecological and water impacts. Mining is a very land-intensive open pit mines. They might be kilometers in circumference. That's just the physical plant of the mine, the digging up of a big hole in the ground and maybe some subsidiary infrastructure, energy, water provision, all of that type of thing. But that's just still the mine itself. Then if we look at the science on the impacts of mining, they can go for many kilometers. We're talking about potentially 20, 50, et cetera, kilometers. If a mine is near the essential watershed area or the head of a stream, we can just see that quite literally any toxins either involved in mining, like chemical agents that are applied, or sometimes oxidized rocks that are unearthed by the mining process, all of that can flow downstream and can affect communities quite far away from the mine. That brings me immediately to the water impacts. There's two types of water impacts that are important. One is that mining, and particularly certain sectors like copper, I'll name right away, are very water hungry. They need a lot of fresh water to process the minerals. So they're a consumer of water, but they're also, as I just mentioned, a contaminator of water. So you're using water, you're also polluting water, and that poses a problem for human consumption and also, of course, for other water-dependent industries, be it agriculture or, as I just mentioned, data centers, which are also very water hungry. And we know that in general, drought is intensifying precisely due to climate. So we have we have the kind of land footprint, which is irreversible in many cases. The way that it changes the land itself is very hard to fully remediate. We have water usage and contamination. We have physical waste because you dig a huge pit in the ground. Those rocks don't just disappear, and only a small percentage of what's in those rocks is the valuable mineral. And actually, in certain sectors, I'll name copper again, which is hugely important for the energy transition, the situation's getting worse, where we've exploited a lot of the best copper deposits over hundreds of years. And now the ones being exploited, there's even a lower percentage of copper. All that means is that the physical waste component is higher. And that results in what are called tailing stacks, tailing ponds, tailing basins. Those are stacks or ponds of oftentimes somewhat sludgy physical waste. That then poses its own environmental hazards if that breaches, which can happen, and safety hazards. We've had examples really horrifying over the past few years even, where a contained waste pile has breached its containment, caused an avalanche that actually harms human life and destroys farms and causes all sorts of safety issues. I'm not even getting into biodiversity, which can be profoundly impacted by mining. Deforestation, especially in semi-tropical areas where mining takes place, is quite important impact. But we get the idea. There's a lot of ecological and water impacts. I'll just name a couple of other impacts that are actually somewhat related. The other is social impact. When mining communities show up, in a lot of jurisdictions, they're supposed to consult with indigenous communities or other local communities. Often those consultations either don't happen or they're so superficial that communities actually are triggered to protest, not even always over the initial environmental grievance, but because of the feeling of exclusion from governance. So we see that a very volatile combination in terms of protest is concern about water, environment, livelihoods, combined with an exclusionary governance model that does not honor even the rights that exist on paper. There's often divisions that are sowed within communities, whether intentionally or not, where some communities might support the mining, others don't. There's governance exclusion. There's a lot going on at once, and communities, the social fabric can actually fray quite a bit in these moments. Just two other things that I'll name that are maybe a bit more related to global South context, but could become relevant in the global North too, depending how things pan out, which is the issue of ownership and who benefits economically, and then the issue of volatile commodity markets. And they're somewhat connected. We have this longstanding legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism in which the countries that provide a lot of the raw materials to the global economy are not the economic beneficiaries of that. They don't own the resources, or even if they do, a lot of the revenues are captured as profits by the firms, and they feed into supply chains that where the value-added stuff happens elsewhere. So there's often contestation around how to ensure that more revenue goes to the countries that pay the social and environmental costs for all of this, and also are draining their own non-renewable resources. And that is all exacerbated by the kind of classic and well-known volatility of commodity markets, where for a variety of reasons that I don't have to get into, they might be a little technical. But what we do know, what is, I think, quite clear to listeners is that these markets, whether it's oil, copper, food markets as well, are subject to these, and lithium is like a super emblematic example because it's been super volatile, are subject to these what are called boom and bust price cycles, which definitely are problematic for investors and firms, but are even more problematic for the countries whose revenue streams rely on extraction, because they can't plan a year out in terms of their own tax revenue and what kind of programs they can fund. And so that introduces just a lot of economic instability into countries that have extractive or that predominate, where extractive sectors predominate.
Your book was very good at describing at least Chile's efforts to move on from being a country for extraction and develop its economy in a sense, and where it doesn't seem yet to have succeeded in that.
Yeah, it is a real challenge because there are different ways to escape the trap of extraction and escape economic volatility and social conflicts that pervade extraction. One is to move on to a totally different economic sector. We used to do a lot of extraction here. We're going to remediate. We're going to do agriculture. We're going to do tourism in this landscape. So one is to really switch out of extraction. The other, which is a bit more popular among policymakers, is to do value added. Instead of leaving extraction behind, you retain the extractive node of the supply chain and climb up the supply chain to the parts that involve more profit, more technological sophistication, maybe a bit more workforce development and jobs and prestige as well in the global economy. Instead of just mining lithium, you're also developing the cathode materials, you're maybe manufacturing battery cells, maybe you get all the way to an electric vehicle. And we could see how there's China is a role model here, but also some countries like Indonesia that, putting aside their huge environmental issues around nickel mining in Indonesia, it is a fact that the government's policies have allowed them to move up a few rungs in the value chain ladder, and they're no longer just nickel exporters. They now are further down the battery supply chain. This is the dream, and some countries have achieved it or partially achieved it. It's very hard because, first of all, if your entire political economy is structured around extraction, it can be difficult to pivot to these more sophisticated technological sectors where the extractive elements are an input for. You need to develop in-state knowledge and capacity of how the whole supply chain works. You need to partner with firms without being like super exploited by them, like partner with firms and actually get some of that technological transfer and knowledge rather than just be yet another kind of relatively low rung on the kind of overall supply chain. And then there are issues around how many jobs does a battery supply chain actually generate. A lot of this is quite capital, more than labor intensive. There's the issue of equity, like you can move up the supply chain, but the benefits of that can still be very maldistributed within your society. There are a number of challenges out there, but there's some very interesting policy thinking from Africa to South Asia to Latin America, and quite progressive, at least in its ideological orientation, around how to leverage critical minerals deposits into more sustained and balanced forms of development that are not buffeted by the winds of commodity volatility and actually can be sovereign and regionally integrated and provide more for their own local populations.
I'd like to talk a little bit about what's going on maybe in Portugal and maybe around the EU's position and how that relates to others.
Portugal and the EU configuration is interesting. Even before the pandemic, EU policymakers were thinking very concertedly about onshoring supply chains for advanced energy technologies such as lithium batteries. And I mentioned before the pandemic because it was then during the pandemic that this thinking got more socialized across the EU government structure and member states and became more salient. Vulnerable supply chains during the pandemic are a well-known story. Then we have Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have heightening tensions with China, especially with the US, but also the EU and China, which all kind of redounds to the EU having more of a concerted policy both around raw materials and around the industrial strategy to deploy those materials within the region, which has then led to an interesting outcome that we mentioned earlier of opening up extractive frontiers within Europe, within the European Union, within the European continent as well, and also in third countries in Africa and Latin America, where the EU has longstanding trade, sometimes based in colonial relationships in the past. And so it's a whole panorama of how the EU is navigating being a resource-reliant region in a new era of industrial strategy that starts from the mine and goes through the factory to final consumption. In the Iberian Peninsula, and especially Portugal, but also in Spain, there are a number of lithium projects. The marquee one is the Savannah Resources Project in northern Portugal, which has been the target of concerted and ongoing resistance, social discontent. Lithium policy was even part of why the prime minister had to resign due to corruption scandals over that. But the EU has been and is getting quite involved in promoting, whether it's that project, whether it's the Vulcan project in Germany, there's projects in France. And then beyond the European Union itself, the EU has been quite interested in Serbia developing a lithium mine, despite massive protests that initially temporarily shelved that mine. It's now reopened with active participation of the EU. And so what this looks like on the ground, oftentimes, it depends on the context, but Portugal's a great example of this, is local communities that oftentimes are from less wealthy, less politically powerful regions or subregions of Europe itself. We all know the history of Portugal, the debt crisis, the Eurozone, the austerity measures. So already Portuguese people are concerned about their place in the European Union, feel a sort of inequality. And then layered on top of that, now we're going to be the extractive frontier for car makers in Germany. How do we benefit from this? And not only that, but our agricultural sector, which is quite interesting in Covas de Boroso, where I did my field work, where it's a heritage agricultural sector, meaning it has longstanding practices where the agriculture is quite embedded with the beautiful forests of the region, where there's common land and resource ownership. It almost feels like a blast from the past in certain ways, like the enclosures never happened there or something. But it's very much in the present, and they participate in contemporary food markets and food culture, but they're very interested in preserving their agricultural system and the natural beauty that surrounds it. And that fight has gotten fierce. It's gotten existential for the community. It reminds me of very similar conflicts I've witnessed between Latin American agricultural communities and mega corporations. The EU now has its critical raw material strategy. Some of it has to do with recycling and methods I would be in favor of that are more circular. It's definitely in some cases hitting the real constraint of community level conflict, of feelings of dispossession and exclusion, and a sense that the economic benefits may not trickle down to the communities where the mining is happening and may instead be captured by automakers and battery makers that are in the wealthier parts of the continent.
One thing that really runs through your book is this real conflict between the energy transition, particularly for renewables, related to the fight against climate change, and what might be, as a result of this renewed extraction for this energy transition, creating a whole new set of problems and possibly continuing this extractive and perhaps neocolonial model. Your book does talk about what things you could be done about it, but I guess there will be some people, and I think you hint in your book that people in the climate movement have been critical of your work, or your research at least, because it does undermine, in a sense, their kind of smooth vision of an energy transition.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's an interesting moment to contemplate it, because I would say, first and foremost, the energy transition's not smooth. Yes, we can point to really amazing results in certain places in the world where we're seeing, for example, the fuller decarbonization of electricity, but yet fossil fuels remain relevant to other parts of the economy. We could take these super contradictory and interesting examples where, for example, where nickel processing in Indonesia is increasingly being fueled by captive coal plants that are being built only to process the nickel that is ending up in batteries and electric vehicles. And this is not to blame Indonesia in particular. These are structural contradictions that are not about any one policy decision, but what we're seeing is an all of the above, or maybe better put, kind of energy addition process where with some important exceptions, overall, we have increasing growth in the fossil fuel industry, record profit years recently, and the growth of renewables deployment. The main issue with the energy transition is that it's that we have not figured out a politically successful or palatable way to really keep fossil fuels in the ground. We have figured out ways to incentivize renewable energy, but in a growing energy system, especially with the data center thing, we can have more of everything and we then have more emissions, and we're not really actually doing mitigation, we're just doing addition. And then even on the front of electric vehicles, what we're seeing, unfortunately, in the US is a quite important slowdown in EV adoption. Now, slowdown in the rate of growth, right? To be super technical, so no one bugs me about that. Each year people buy more EVs, but the growth rates are slowing, which is then making automakers question their own plans for by 2030, by 2035, whatever it was, fully electric. Of course, we can implicate them in the fact that they're still selling these gas guzzler SUVs. I'm not letting them off the hook. But for whoever we're blaming, the reality is that the transition is not smooth. It's not linear. It's not rapid. Outside of China and parts of Europe, it's going slowly and facing a lot of political pushback, including in Europe, including, of course, in the US, above all with our current Trump administration. So maybe that's some throat clearing, but I think that it's worthwhile taking the big picture around where are the frictions, where are the tensions, so that we can right-size this issue around extraction and around critical attention, such as my own, to the extractive frontiers of the energy transition. There's a number of reasons that we've already discussed as to why extraction poses its own set of problems for a smooth transition. There is community level backlash. There's the volatile markets for these sectors, difficulty coordinating supply and demand and the overarching supply chains. But there are alternatives, and I really talk about those at length in the end of the book. When I present this vision in a moment, it might seem a bit radical. It might seem like, wow, that would be a wholesale change. But what I want to emphasize is that there's a broad vision. Lots of pieces of it are already happening in places in the world, and we can work as advocates and organizers and thinkers to expand on existing successes. So what my vision is, and I just want to say I developed this collaboratively with colleagues at Climate and Community Institute, is that if we work backwards, not from corporate profit lines, not from a corporate vision of what the transition should look like, but instead work backwards from our goals, which are getting to zero emissions in the transportation sector, which is the number one source of emissions in the US, number two source of emissions globally, and then human need. And I would say the human need here is for mobility, which I view as a right to move around and get where they need to go, and to do so cleanly without localized pollution that is harmful to them and their neighborhoods. So if the ecological need is zero emissions as quickly as possible, the human need is mobility, and we also don't want to destroy every landscape in the process of addressing those needs, then we get to a very different place in terms of what volume of extraction is actually necessary and what should the extracted minerals be prioritized for. There's tons of alarming forecasts that I read all the time that maybe your listeners have seen in the newspaper, like we need 500 new mines tomorrow just for batteries, whatever it is. And then if we add the data centers and the wind turbines and the transmission infrastructure, it gets really alarming in terms of the sheer number of mines that are forecasted to be necessary to meet growing demand. But again, those are not taking the starting point we took as a collaboration. If we look at what is essential for electric mobility to make sure that people have access to electric buses, electric bikes. In rural landscapes, yes, maybe electric vehicles, individual passenger vehicles are necessary. Maybe you don't have the public transit infrastructure. If we build in things like recycling and recovery of minerals, we also think about actually urban planning. And if people live in denser environments, they tend to drive less. So we move away from this idea that every single car and then some needs to be replaced with an EV. And instead of just how to get people around in a way that's good for the climate and good for the environment, then we actually need much less lithium. And we were the first study to show that, which is not to pat ourselves on the back, but more to say how limited the imaginary is, even of great climate advocates and wonks out there and energy experts, that they really take the individual passenger vehicle as their point of departure, especially in the US and Western Europe and East Asia. That's the goal. Everyone has an EV, right? Well, what if the goal was everyone has access to clean mobility? We would actually need a lot less lithium, and quite dramatic figures. Just to give an example, like between 2023 and 2050, in order to provide for everyone to get around and to get to fully zero emissions and to build in some recycling, we would need 66% less lithium than the worst case scenario of everyone having an individual car and zero recycling and the cars that get bigger and bigger with bigger batteries. It's really quite a big difference in terms of the volumes of extraction. And the last thing I'd like to kind of leave listeners with is that a lot of what drives the overall harm of extraction is simply the absolute volume of extraction. The more you extract, the larger the mines, the more complex and lengthier the supply chains and global shipping that's happening. Just the sheer volume of extraction drives the sheer volume of harm. And there's a way that we can govern extraction better at any volume, but there's also a way that governance is always playing catch up when we're like dramatically increasing how large the mines are and how many there are. And it's also very hard to govern in that gold rush moment, to actually adequately govern and regulate. So I advocate, along with others, for a holistic view of what the actual raw material needs are for human and ecological need, and to reorient our perspective in that way. There are still hard discussions because this doesn't mean zero lithium mining, but reducing the number of mines means we can govern them better. We can get more creative with ownership and economic benefit structures. We can think about regulation and best case siting for least harm. And a lot of interesting possibilities open up when there's not like an onslaught of poorly regulated mines.
Thank you very much to Thea Riofrancos for her time. You can find a link to her new book, Extraction, published by Norton Press or Icon Books in the UK, in our podcast blurb, as well as other suggested reading by Thea. If you haven't done so already, and if you like the podcast, please do give us a podcast review on your podcast platform, as it will help others to find us. Thanks also to Vasco Kostovsky for audio engineering the show, and we'll be back again for another interview in 2 weeks. I'm Alasdair McEwen, and thank you for listening.